So I am Mona Ibrahim. I am with Interactive Entertainment Law Group. We are one of the most prolific, I guess you could say, uh, or largest as far as market share in North America as far as video game representation and representing companies in the industry. We represent Square Enix, Namco Bandai, D3 Publishers of America, Double Fine, which is awesome. I was really excited whenever we netted them. We represent PSYOP and a whole slew of indies, Iron Galaxy out in Chicago. And we represent both ends of the spectrum, and we've been doing it for a long time. So we kind of have a pretty good perspective of how the publisher-developer relationship has evolved. So before I start, I want to kind of get an idea of who I'm talking to. Are you guys all developers? Are you students? Are you employees with a certain company? Where are you guys at?
Developer, contractor.
Okay.
I'm a lawyer. I'm general counsel of the Georgia Game Developers Association.
Excellent. Very nice to meet you.
As game designer and creative director.
I'm a student.
Okay. All right. Well, it's very nice to meet you guys, and hopefully my talk will be helpful for you. But if you guys have any questions throughout, by all means, just let me know, and when we can talk it out. So, getting started. Uh, Within the past 10 years, we've seen games change a lot. We've seen the way distribution has changed, and we've seen the way deals have changed as a result. And the biggest way that has changed is in deal structure and what publishers offer developers today. So as far as how the old model was, typically publishers controlled everything. You could only distribute through certain channels. It was brick and mortar, and you would distribute to consoles. There were PC games, obviously. I mean, that's where most gaming started. But as far as mass consumption, consoles were where it was at. In the very early years, it wasn't necessarily like that. It started indie, it grew into the publisher control, and then it's now creeping back into indie. But as far as how publisher and developer agreements evolved early on, while publishers were in control of all brick and mortar retail and all major sales channels, they were not necessarily fair to developers. I remember when I first started, or when I first decided to go into video game law. It happened when I was getting my LLM in entertainment and media law, and I took a course with the person who is now my boss, Patrick Sweeney, who was a professor at Southwestern Law School, and he taught a course on video game law contracts. And prior to that, I'd planned on working in music, and I became disenchanted with the music industry after working in it for too long. And I started looking for other areas of entertainment where I wanted to focus my attention. And I've always been a gamer. I grew up on Sierra Games and Leisure Suit Larry and King's Quest. So I was an avid video game fan. And I thought, well, I like video games. I'll try this class out. I'll try it on for size, see how much I like it. And I looked at my first publisher developer deal. And I was like, these people need help. And obviously I was referring to developers because the deal was terrible. I had never seen something so unfair except in a music deal. And, musicians are inherently naive. So we expect it when they get terrible deals and they sign things and then they bring it to you after they sign. This is why I didn't become a music lawyer. They sign things, they bring it to you after they sign, and they say, I don't think this is fair. What can I do about it? And there's nothing you can do after you've signed it, obviously. But I didn't expect developers who, are known to be analytical and procedural to fall for the same trap. But they do time and time again, or they did time and time again. They still do time and time again. But I saw this agreement, and my knee-jerk reaction was, these people need help. And that was kind of the same thing that got me into music. And I thought, well, this is something that I really want to look into. And so that's how I kind of developed a passion for working with independent developers. And then 3 years ago, when I joined this firm, I sold my soul to the devil, and now I work on both sides of the fence. So, but as I said, whenever I first started working in this industry, I just noticed how unfair deals were to developers, as far as crunch, as far as quality of life, as far as what they were being paid, as far as their intellectual property rights. Everything was work for hire. They didn't get to keep anything that they created. Um, as far as how net royalties was calculated and the double dipping that was involved in net royalty calculations. And what I mean by that is when we're talking of cost of goods sold, when we're talking about reasonable reserves and then returns, and reasonable reserves exist to cover things like price protection and returns and broken and damaged products. But so that's a form of double dipping that we can talk about, but honestly, well, we should talk about because publishers still do it. But overall, it was just the structure of the deals and how where developers receive their money from, because all of the recouping of anything that the publisher spent came directly out of the developer's cut. It wasn't taken out of 100% of gross, which is something that we're seeing more frequently now. It was taken out of the developer's percentage. So the developer was essentially paying for their own game, and they were paying for a game that they no longer owned. And the likelihood of them seeing anything past their initial advance was very unlikely, maybe a 10% chance. And that's if the publisher cared enough to put marketing dollars behind it. And so developers were living hand to mouth. They were padding their budgets out as much as possible because they knew that was probably going to be the last dollar they were ever going to see from the publisher. Because, finishing off recoupment and getting their money back, or the publisher getting their money back and then getting paid out from a horrendously draconian calculation of net, probably meant the developer was never going to see a dime. So that's how the industry grew up. That was our adolescence, was that publisher-developer relationship, where publishers controlled everything. They were the rock stars. We had EA, who has since then suffered at the hands of media and consumers and industry alike in terms of quality of life issues, and various other publishers who experienced similar treatment, including Nintendo and a few others, are now trying to reform themselves because they're realizing that that model no longer works because of where we are now. So traditionally, the way that the industry functioned was everything centralized around the publisher. Publisher controlled distribution, manufacture, retail, and they controlled the developer. If they didn't buy out the developer outright, or they didn't control the developer outright, then they owned all the rights to anything that was being developed. And this played out also in terms of any time of content licensing. So if you had a game about Batman or any other Marvel franchise, well, Batman is DC, any other Marvel franchise or any kind of Disney game or anything like that, you have your content licensors, you have your talent who produced the artwork or assets or voice acting later on. Or if you guys remember those really cool, I don't know, I guess they were like, there was a term for them, and I can't remember it. They were like the live action video games. You had like Gabriel Knight 2 was one of them. You had Phantasmagoria. Yeah, The Ripper. Has anybody played that? Please tell me somebody has played The Ripper. It has Christopher Walken. You have to play this game. And it's still a good game. But so yeah, you had talent at that point because obviously you needed talent deals for people like Christopher Walken, who decided to star in a video game, which was so good. And it had Blue Oyster Cult on the soundtrack. Don't Fear the Reaper was the title track for it. So if you haven't checked it out, I strongly recommend looking into it. I'm sure you can find a sim for it. So you had your talent, and then you had your developers. Either you had your independent developer, or they just sourced it in house, or they outsourced the tech and the assets and did everything else in house. So, but everything centralized around the publisher. Publisher controlled all. Now we look at how things are today and how things have evolved. And the reason things have evolved, you guys probably already know this, so this is superfluous, but independent games have come into their own. We had the indie apocalypse where we had a glut in the market and nobody could sell anything because there was just so much content out there. And now we're getting to the point where we're developing more effective marketing strategies, more effective distribution systems through Steam. The price point of entry has become much lower, and there are more funding options than ever before. We have crowdfunding and things like that. And a lot of our clients I have about, I'm trying to think of an indie client I have that has not done a crowdfunding campaign in the last year. I know that we are doing one with ICU, which is a really, really cool horror game show that's coming out. You're nodding your head like you know it. Have you
Yeah,
seen it? Okay. Uh,
that's cool.
it's out of USC. It's a couple of students out of there who came up with this project at the school, and now they are uh, putting it out to market, and they got to hold on to their rights, I think. We're still figuring that out. And they they just started their crowdfunding round. They raised something like 76K, like a couple of students, 76K within a few hours of their launch of the crowdfunding campaign. Um, we've had Citadel, who is doing their own internal funding for the game Shards Online. They started with a crowdfunding campaign, and then they've grown, or a Kickstarter, and now they've grown into just doing their own crowdfunding from their website and from their own personal outreach. We have games like Epic Tavern, which is using Kickstarter as a form of promotion. The money is nice, but ultimately they're doing it as a way to get the game out there and to get it recognized and to get on people's radar. Uh, and then you have things like early access, which allow, like on Steam, you have ways for developers to get their games up there early and get people interested and start generating interest on like a prototype or an alpha before it's really even finished. And you have different methods of release, which definitely helps. We have a lot of episodic games. Silver Lining, which was by one of my former clients before I started working at this company, Phoenix Online, developed the Silver Lining games, and they did everything episodic. And that was in the early days of episodic release. So it was really kind of cool to see the beginning of that. So we've seen an evolution in how the industry has grown, and now things have become more developer focused. And now we're trying to figure out the role of the publisher. So what is the publisher doing in all of this? We have independent distribution, we have independent marketing, we have grassroots marketing through YouTube and streamers and Twitch. We have independent development where the tools are so accessible compared to what they used to be. And we have digital distribution through Xbox and through consoles, which means that you are not having to manufacture individual discs or individual cartridges in order to put a game out to market. So most of the barriers that developers faced and most of the reasons why developers went to publishers in the first place seem to have disappeared. That being said, I still work for publishers, so I have to say this: publishers still fulfill a vital role. And most of that role is money. Another part of that role is going to be marketing. So where we are now in terms of independent developers and their role is going to be digital distribution directly to the end user. They run their own marketing campaigns. They get their own investment through angel investment, friends and family, crowdfunding. And then occasionally they'll bring in a publisher. And the cool thing is, and I've seen this happen with a lot of our clients, we have Iron Galaxy and PsyOp have both moved into this model where they've decided to, as developers, become publishers. And the biggest benefit of that is that they are people who have been there. They are people who have netted successful enough games to where they can finance other people's games. So there's a lot to be said for that, and there's a lot that they can offer. There's also a glut of new publishers on the market, and I'm not just talking about the developers turned publishers or the existing publishers like Square Enix, Nexon, um, D3 publishers, obviously, Nintendo. We have the traditional big pants wearing adult publishers, and then we have the fun and hip new indie publishers like, again, Iron Galaxy, and we have Phoenix Online Publishing. Um, there is Iron Galaxy, which is starting to do publishing. We have a GameStop, which is breaking into the publishing route, and they're starting to release indie games through their stores, and they have a really cool model that we got to negotiate for them. So GameStop is also one of our clients, and they are trying to release games to indie games to channels other than digital, so you can actually see your indie game in box form, whether for console or for PC. And we have a really cool financing model for that too. But so lots of new options out there, lots of new opportunities, lots and lots of new publishers to choose from, all of which have money and all of which are saying, we'll give you money if you do things our way. Sort of. Because now independent developers have more control. They're the ones, getting the licenses with Marvel. They're the ones finding third-party tech. They're the ones in control of marketing. They're the ones in control of the marketing spend. Publishers are not playing the essential role that they used to, but they still kind of want to be there. They still want to fulfill a vital role, and a lot of them still do. And also, another aspect of this is that a lot of independent developers today keep their lights on by still following, to a certain extent, the old model, where they will be contractors for existing publishers and develop, work for hire agreement, or develop based on work for hire agreements just to keep the lights on, while they on the side develop their own projects that they then release independently. So as I was saying before, we have new barriers of entry. We have a lot of clients who are developing their own tools from scratch, which is really cool. And then we have Unity, which helps. And we have Havoc, which is another great engine, although they were recently bought out by Microsoft, so I'm not quite sure how handy that's going to be now. You have Epic, Unreal, thank you, blank. And then you have Game Maker Pro and the RPG Maker, which might actually be Game Maker. I'm trying to think. So we have a lot of different ways to develop games, and far fewer barriers of entry because a lot of these operate on indie licenses, which are at a reduced rate. You also have free licenses for non-commercial products, and you also have mobile development, which has kind of opened the door to new revenue channels and easier distribution models and cheaper and faster distribution. I mean, we've had clients who've pumped out, I think one of my first clients developed developed one of the endearingly simple apps I've ever seen. And it was a fingerprint scanner that didn't actually scan your fingerprint. It just pretended like it scanned your fingerprint, and it was supposed to be a security device, and I have no idea how that was supposed to function. But they made millions off of this app, and they developed it in 2 weeks. And he then, the head of the company then went on to close down the multiple companies that he spawned for app development after that and started writing books on how to become a millionaire by app development. And this is a person who had never programmed a game or anything else in his life. So he, literally just somebody fresh out of the box came into this industry, busted out an app in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and released the product, made millions, and then just walked right back out the door, never to be seen or heard from again on the iPhone store. So you can do that now. Imagine trying to do that 20 years ago. It would have been impossible. Um, there's no way anybody would have been able to pull that off. Becoming a developer was a full-time job. It was, a new and sexy industry that people wanted to dedicate their lives to. Something that we still want to dedicate our lives to. But the fact that somebody can just walk in and pull that off is kind of jarring. It kind of makes you realize that um, you never know it's going to be a hit, and you never know it's going to be successful, and you never know whether yours is going to flop or whether you're going to be the next multi-million dollar app producer. Um, I should probably start redirecting myself to at least some of the slide content. Uh, so as I was saying, you have free open source low cost engine, and then we have early access. And so we represent Dean Hall, who did the Daisy or the Daisy game, which is a former Arma mod. And does anybody else here play Arma? Because I'm a diehard Arma 3 fan. It was an Arma 2 mod. And does anybody know what Arma is? Okay. Yeah, so it's a military sim essentially. It's a first-person shooter military sim, and it's extremely realistic in that you run around endlessly in this huge open space and you never see anyone for hours and hours and hours, and then you suddenly do, and it's really exciting because you're shooting at each other and you're killing each other, and then you lose all your shit when you die, and then you respawn. So it I tell my boyfriend this constantly because I it teaches you about impermanence and the ephemeral nature of all things in life. So it can be a very zen game if you decide to take it that way. Otherwise, it's just really frustrating whenever you've built all this stuff and it gets blown up or you lose it all. But anyway, Daisy is an Arma mod, and it has been, I think it's still in early access, and it has been in early access for about 3 years. Because I'm pretty sure it was in early access when I started working at Interactive Entertainment Law Group, and we were representing Dean Hall, and I don't think it ever came out of early access. I think they just stopped. But I feel like there was like some news on it or a new release for it within the past 6 months or so. So I don't think it's completely stopped. I think there's still some development on it. But yeah, Daisy was one of those games that became a hit in early access. This was an unfinished product on the marketplace being sold in early access, and the game, this unfinished title that still had so many bugs, it was such it filled you with many complex feelings. It's a great game. It really is a fantastic game, and I was really, really, really excited to play it because, as I said, I play Arma, and he's our client. So, of course, I'm super, super excited because I was a huge fan of Dean Hall and the original DayZ mod. So I was really, really excited to play this game, and it made me feel very complicated. Uh, but it was a huge, huge success, and he did very, very well. And now he's off developing. He sold the IP, and now he's off developing all sorts of other stuff. He's developing. There's a rocket something game that he's coming out with. That it's he has a lot of great ideas, and he throws them out constantly. And it's he's one of those geniuses. So we have games that do very well in early access. We have another game, Moving Hazard, that's been in early access for a little while, and it's getting ready to move to launch. And it's a great way to get your game out there, get some slush funds in there, some slush money that you can kind of play with to facilitate further development. It gets people interested in the game. It gets press on the game. It gets people playing your game, which means streamers, which is far more effective these days than any other form of marketing, which is interesting because I don't really watch it. I'd rather play the game, but that's me. Unless it's Giant Bomb. I'm a big fan of Giant Bomb playthroughs. Those are super entertaining.
Like personally, when I was in like high school, the reason why I would watch Let's Plays is because I couldn't afford them.
Mhm.
That's the big takeaway that I saw.
That's true, and a lot of people do that. Or because you're not sure if you want to play it, you're not sure if you want to buy it, or because you cannot pull off the speed runs and you just want to see it done. I know that that's how I felt about Dark Souls, because no way can I ever pull off a speed run of.
The Dark Souls speedruns are ridiculous.
They are silly. Um, could never do it. I remember, I think I spent 3 hours on the first boss in Dark Souls 2. And I almost cried. I was so frustrated. I'm like, I'm never going to get this game. I did significantly better on Dark Souls 3, fortunately. Never played Dark Souls 1 all the way through. Uh, so, what do we have to play with as far as being developers in this new and thriving industry? And what do publishers do in that role? And the vital role that publishers play as far as getting games to market is going to be the relationships that they have. Uh, I can tell you that Xbox and Sony, or Microsoft and Sony, and even to some extent Steam, do require Xbox and Sony in particular, and Nintendo especially, do require a prior existing relationship of some sort before you can release to their product, unless you already have a huge, huge following and you're just porting the title to them. Uh, Getting a game on XBLA or on PS4 or on PSN is not an easy task. They have a lot of requirements. They have a lot of things that you need to do for compliance, and they also do want that pre-existing relationship. They get a lot of demands for games to be put on their stores, and they can't service everybody. So the pre-existing relationship is really helpful there, and that's where a lot of publishers come into play. And that's also why a lot of developers like PsyOp and like Iron Galaxy wind up going into publishing, because they've established these pre-existing relationships the hard way by getting a really successful game and developing this relationship through that and negotiating that relationship and then releasing. Android and Apple, anybody can release to that. Steam, there is a process, and getting a game greenlit can be a trial. Um, Getting getting the player base that you need, and the feedback that you need, and the receptiveness you need to get a game greenlit on Steam can be a struggle unless you have that pre-existing relationship. So this industry is founded on relationships, and the one area where publishers will almost always be the primary resource is going to be those relationships. But that being said, they are not as necessary to get a game released in general. As I said, anybody can develop a mobile game as I said, 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Never touched the industry before. But, you can develop for Apple, you can develop for Android, and if the game is successful, you can port it to PC, or, you can develop to PC initially and then port it to mobile, which is something that we also see with some of our clients. But developers no longer need publishers to get a game to launch. They no longer necessarily need them for funding, because we have so many alternate funding methods, and they no longer need them for actual release on consoles, because there are so many other digital distribution channels. So it gives developers a lot more wiggle room as far as what kind of deal terms they're going to negotiate. And there are several areas where negotiation is really, really important. We're moving away from the draconian model, and we're coming up with new financial models for publisher and developer relationships. We've negotiated deals where we have publishers who are matching on crowdfunding. So if you raise, say, 500K, they will match that, or or double it depending on what your game budget is. And so they'd pay anywhere from another 500K to match, or $1 million if they decide to double if you hit your benchmark. Some will cover what the crowdfund wasn't able to raise. So if you are trying to get your entire budget through crowdfunding, a publisher can come in and say, look, we will fund this for a cut in the game. If you don't meet your benchmark, we'll cover the rest. And then you'll have a sliding scale as far as how the cut will be broken down. So let's say developer A decides that they're going to do a crowdfunding campaign through Kickstarter, and their goal is $750K for the full development budget. If they only raise, say, $50K, and the publisher comes in and says, okay, we'll cover the rest of your budget, then they will get a bigger chunk of the pie, obviously, because they're taking the bigger financial risk. If the developer raises, say, $500K, and then the developer or the publisher is only bringing in an additional $150, is that right? No, $250. Then the publisher will get a smaller cut. Developer gets a bigger piece of the pie, but the publisher will still get a cut because they're still, putting in the last bit of the budget needed in order to get the game to launch. So that's one of the financial models that we're working with now, and it's probably one of the most interesting as far as what's.
Finish your thought. I just had a question.
Oh, go ahead. What's your question?
I was just wondering, like in that kind of scenario where the publisher basically, they have a sliding risk. Do they have an out if let's say the Kickstarter is $50K and they were trying to get 700?
Yeah, they'll set a benchmark of what, like a minimum of what it has to raise before they're willing to pay the rest. So there will be, if they sent their benchmark to 150K, if it reaches less than 150K, they can bow out and say this game it's too high risk. There aren't enough eyes on it to make it worth our while to invest. So they will generally cover themselves in that regard. Some other models that we use, obviously there's the traditional, we'll pay all of it. There is a marketing commitment model where the game is already ready for launch or is in a close enough form to launch to where there's not much else that's going to need to be paid for as far as development. So the entire advance will go to a marketing spend. And it goes either, the marketing spend will be treated as a minimum guarantee, or it will be treated as this is how much we're going to invest in this game. So the developer doesn't really see a lot of that actual money. Or they kind of split the baby, and the publisher and the developer will have this marketing money pool that they'll pull from as far as developing their marketing strategy and their marketing budget as far as how they're going to distribute that money in terms of marketing and user acquisition. So there are lots of different ways to structure these deals, and there are lots of different ways to get money from publishers and the kind of money that you want.
How common is it for the developer to hold on to the IP at this point?
That's what I'm getting onto next. So that's where we come up to their next step. And as I said, a lot of some of our clients, we have like White Moon Dreams and Iron Galaxy, who are both pretty well established indie developers. They put out some great titles. They've been around for a long time, but they make the bread and butter by doing work for hire deals. So in that context, they still give away their rights, but it's just free. It's kind of free money for them at that point. The development is fairly straightforward. They don't have to come up with their own IP. They don't have to come up with their own funding. They don't have to come up with their own investment. It's just we give you money to make this game, and that's it. And that's for a lot of developers, that is a great way to keep the lights on because it can be a returning business. You'll be an outsourced developer for a particular publisher or a particular developer, like larger developer, and you can just churn out titles for them or churn out assets for them, and they can keep they can keep their lights on. Where developers get into trouble is poor presentation. Being desperate is a really scary thing for a developer. Not having a good idea of your real budget for development and your real budget for market, and not having all of your I's dotted and T's crossed, not having your profits and losses report, not having a business plan, not having all of your seats filled and all of your hats worn as far as corporate. So, not having legal counsel, obviously, not having your CFO, not having an accountant, more than an attorney. I have to say, developers are really terrible at accounting, which blows my mind because you're programmers, people. You should know math. But they are bad at paying their taxes. So they tend to do that last. They tend to get their accountant last. And I think the accountant is somebody you should get before you get an attorney. Don't tell my boss I said that. But accounting is very, very important. Having your books, kept properly, especially if you are planning on going into publishing later on yourself. Any revenue that you earn, and in terms of getting investment, this is vitally important. If you're not going through a publisher, just getting investment in general, any competent investor is going to require books and records and your financials and full disclosure and due diligence. And what that means is that they need to see a paper trail as far as your assets. They need to see a paper trail as far as your financing, as far as your business plan, as far as your corporate paperwork. So making sure that you have your bylaws in order, your bylaws adequately represent whatever equity agreement you're entering into with this investor. And that's something else that I kind of want to get into as far as financial models for developers now. Because another model that we are seeing more and more frequently is equity-based funding from publishers. So we have publishers, and I cannot mention which ones and who they're investing in, but they are starting to take an equity cut in the developer instead of a straight royalty or instead of a straight cut in the product. They're taking a full investment in the developer itself. So they're getting a percentage of the developer's overall profits. And, they become shareholders, so they become stakeholders in that developer without it being an actual acquisition of the developer. So they'll only take, say, 20 to 25%. The developer retains rights over and control over the company itself, but they have a major stakeholder that is in the form of a publisher. So that's another financing model. Now, going on to rights with regard to that. For independently developed games, as I said, we still have the work for hire model. That is still a bread and butter model for a lot of our developers, at least. But more and more, at a bare minimum, we make sure that all of our indie developers, even in those work for hire agreements, hold on to their prior tools and technology. So anything that they've developed outside of or contemporaneously with the game itself, including any tools that they've used in the game's development, we want to make sure that they hold on to those. And we make sure that that provision is in each and every single one of our work for hire agreements. And for the newer models for game development, where a game is closer to launch and the developer has invested more into it, developers are holding on to their rights. So they're just licensing the game to publishers. Now, publishers will do everything in their power to handcuff you as far as what you can do with those rights that you still own. They'll make sure that it's exclusive. They will be very vague on how long their publishing rights exist. Even if the term of the contract is like 3 to 5 years, they will retain publishing rights perpetually, is something that I've seen frequently. And admittedly have drafted. Sorry. No, I'm not. That's a lie. I'm not sorry at all. It was the right thing to do at the time. And I've seen weird collaborations where it'll be a co-publishing, co-development deal where it's split ownership. Um, and I've seen that in the most interesting one I've seen for that is for local, like a localized version of a pre-existing game. Obviously, the original publisher retained all the publisher was also the developer, retained all the rights to it. They distributed through another company in China, and this is actually pretty common in Chinese distribution for the localized version. The Chinese company wants to hold on to the rights to the localized version, or at a bare minimum, they want to split the ownership rights in that product, in the localized version. So we negotiated a deal where we had split rights because no way am I going to give them the full release, like the full version of the localized version whenever it's our content. So you see those models as well, where I've drafted a lot of co-publishing deals lately, for a few clients in particular, who know how this. They started off as developers, and I think that's where this comes from. They know what it's like to be a developer, and they are playing a more involved role in the development process as far as input, approval, and contributions in terms of assets, hooking them up with third-party content providers for engines or tools, localization, things like that. So it is a legitimate collaborative effort, and they split the rights. They split the baby. It creates some interesting problems because at that point, who does what if or who owns what if the proverbial feces hits the fan? So we have to negotiate what happens in terms of termination. Who gets to retain publishing rights? What can the developer do to get those rights back? So we'll negotiate buyout provisions on both sides. One party can, negotiate to buy out the rights from the other. So, we have to leave a lot of options open, and we have to see, we have to try to foresee how things could possibly work out in every single worst possible case scenario, which is effectively my job. I have to be the doom and gloom baby, like the doom and gloom angel. So answering your question, getting back to that, it's complicated. It depends. The one answer you will always get from an attorney, which is universal, is it depends. It depends on the circumstances. And because we have more distribution models and, everything is centralized around the developer now, it is more likely that you can negotiate more control as a developer, depending on where you are in the publishing cycle or where you are in the development cycle and how much money you need, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. Who is taking the bigger risk financially? That generally that generally dictates leverage in negotiations as far as ownership of IP. There are a lot of options to choose from, and I'm name dropping here, but some of our clients include Annapurna Pictures and Lionsgate, who do films and now do games. We see that a lot. We see WB and Warner Brothers and a bunch of other companies moving more into the game market and licensing their assets for games. And then you also have companies like Annapurna and Lionsgate, which are opening game divisions. So they are not only licensing their content, but getting into the development business in general, or the publishing business in general. And what that generally means is digital distribution, and they're just putting the marketing dollars behind it. So either they will help push marketing and help come up with a marketing plan, or it's going to be a joint effort between publisher and developer as far as how the marketing strategy is going to work out. And then publishers, so as I said, money is the main reason why people still need publishers, because ultimately this was not always how to put this. It was not always the case where developers could reliably look to other forms of investment to get money for their game. It used to be that publishers were the only resource. So that's why publishers were so integral, because at one point in time, nobody else was daring enough to invest in games outside of those who were entrenched in the industry. Now we're seeing people come out of the woodwork, including, people in film like Annapurna, who are just throwing money at games. And I'm talking about a lot of money into game development, which is an industry that they know very little about. So they're taking a huge risk, but they're hoping to net a pretty substantial reward because games has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. I don't think a lot of people foresaw that. And that's why people are so excited to get in on the ground level. And now we're looking at VR, and a lot of people are moving into VR because that's projected to be the next multi-billion-dollar industry. So we have more and more methods of obtaining money, as I was talking about before, crowdfunding campaigns, etc. I'm not sure what that second symbol is, but I recognize the Patreon and then FIG.
Seeing a lot of equity crowdfunding yet?
SAFE agreements are really, really interesting, and SAFE is kind of the crowdfunding version of equity. And it's interesting, and SAFE is the simple agreement for equity, or simplified agreement for equity, I think is what it stands for. And it was originally... Oh, okay, I just did all this research like 6 months ago, and now it's slipping my brain. But there's basically this template of contracts for equity investment and crowdfunding models. And they have a few different ways in which they function. You have your market valuation, or your minimum valuation, and your valuation cap and your discount, and you have your pro rata rights. So the way that breaks down, if this is something you guys are interested in, but this is how I normally see the crowdfunding equity model shake down. You either have a valuation cap and no discount, you have a discount and no valuation cap, or you have neither, and you just have most favored nations basis across all crowdfunders, or you have, and that's probably the most favorable agreement you can get for the developer, for the person who's trying to receive the funding, and then you have the valuation cap, and the discount and the pro rata rights, which is the one most favorable to the investor. So that also operates on a sliding scale. And so the valuation cap is it's really much easier to do this on paper than it is to do this verbally. But say you have 100,000 shares, and for your first round of investment, and you set a valuation cap of 3 million, but you wind up getting 5 million in investment. The investor will be able to buy in based on however much they kicked in. Let's say they do 500K. They will be able to buy 500K worth of shares at the valuation cap price of 3 million, as opposed to the 5 million actual price. So it's a massive discount. If they do not reach the valuation cap, then if they have the discount also, then they would, if they don't hit the valuation cap trigger, then the discount would kick in. So even if they don't get the discount through the valuation cap, they get a static discount of 20%, which won't apply if the valuation cap is reached.
I'm sorry, is that going to mandate like an S corp or a C corp?
Yeah. Oh, anytime you want to get equity investment, well, for the most part, I've seen LLCs do it too, but you only usually get equity in LLCs if you're doing friends and family investment or angel investors on occasion. But even most angel investors nowadays are going to want to see a C corp or an S corp at a minimum.
When we went S corp, but it was a little too big too fast.
If you if you are not looking at more than 100K revenue, I would almost within your first, like in your annually for the first 3 years or so, I would recommend getting an LLC typically, depending on what your strategy is and if you're planning on getting additional funders. If you are planning on receiving a lot of seed money, or you're going to do seed round of investment, then you're going to want to do a C corp. It's just easier to deal with equity in the C corp form, because LLC equity is not the same as corporate equity, no matter what you may think. And a lot of people tend to confuse the two. And more problematically, a lot of people tend to treat LLC equity in the same way that they treat corporate equity. And it's not something you can really do, because you cannot break down LLC units into like one unit. It has to represent a percentage of ownership, and the entire LLC has to be owned 100% by its members. So the LLC itself can't hold back any actual equity. The LLC itself cannot, in and of its own equity in itself. All equity in an LLC has to be owned by its members, which is why I say you can't really treat corporate shares as LLC shares. But that's going into a whole other tangent. So if that's something that you're interested in learning about, by all means, come to me afterwards and we can break it down and I'll show it to you on paper. Same with the SAFE agreement models, because that can get really complex, and it was like a 6-page memo. So I'm coming up pretty much close to overtime. So I'm going to try to wrap this up pretty quickly. I've already talked about a lot of this, but as far as how games are released nowadays, we're seeing more and more games coming out episodically, released on early access. A lot of games are released for group play, or cooperative play, or MMOs. So you have a lot of different ways in which you can release, and a lot of different ways in which you can get your products to market, and a lot of different publishers who specialize in different things. Like, you wouldn't necessarily want to go to Nexon for a first-person shooter, but they would be a great company to go to if you want to do an MMO. Same with NCSoft. You do have specialized publishers, and if you want a more detailed idea on that and how specialized publishers can benefit a developer, Brandon Sheffield recently wrote an article on Gamasutra on the subject, and it's great. As I was saying before, we do have co-publishing and co-development deals that have become more common as far as ownership and how the rights play out. One more thing that I really want to mention as far as financing models and how these co-development deals pan out. Instead of recovering, and this is something that's, I rarely, except for work for hire deals, I rarely see deals where the publisher is recovering from the developer's cut. So generally, recoupment can be mutual. Both parties can recoup from 100% of net profits, or the publisher recoups, or if the developer is the one who's done most of the funding, the developer recoup first, and then there's the waterfall. So we're seeing more and more models where the publisher, the financials are far less draconian, and it's easier for developers to negotiate terms that are far more equitable and make it more of a partnership than a master-servant relationship, which is how publisher-developer deals traditionally functioned.
When you see marketing-only deals, is the developer usually recouping first, or is it code?
Actually, in most of the marketing deals I've seen, the publisher will still recoup first, but they recoup from 100% of net. So, and if there's live ops, then we'll generally hold out a percentage to go specifically to live ops. So the developer, if they're handling live ops, will be paid out first, like say 30% monthly of net revenue or gross goes to developer for maintenance and live ops or ongoing development for DLC. And as I was saying before, as we were discussing before, IP ownership is much more open and negotiable. We do still have work for hire deals, and as I was saying, it's still a lot of developers' bread and butter. But for their own product, where they're developing independently, they usually get to keep the rights. And I'll let you guys read this because this is stuff that I've already talked about, but the net deductions are now more frequently limited to reasonable things. Price protection is less of an issue because price protection is traditional for retail. It is not a common practice in digital distribution. So at most, a publisher may hold on to reserves. Even that may not be applicable. Sometimes the net will only apply to returns. Cost of goods sold is very rarely included because generally the developer is paying for it anyway. Packaging, warehousing for digital distribution doesn't happen, so that's also not cut from net. So net will be limited to things like user acquisition costs, marketing spend, and either reasonable reserves or returns. And obviously third-party licensing fees and third-party distributors. So if, there's the Steam cut, which obviously is taken out of net, and or the XBLA cut or the PSN cut. And then there's it's probably a client. I apologize. And then there is so yeah. I lost my train of thought. Moving along, as I was saying before, marketing is kind of one of the big ways in which publishers try to succeed. I don't necessarily think that's 100% true on reexamination. Now, they are recovering more from marketing because they are not spending as much in development itself, but their primary function is a piggy bank because they are still the most likely financiers of game development. They do have more marketing resources, and they do have better relationships with distribution channels, including any kind of foreign distribution and localization. They will be able to provide assets that most developers can't handle on their own or can't obtain on their own. I've seen fanlations, not something you want for a polished product that you want to release internationally, because people will screw with you in fanlations. If you try to crowdsource your translations, it can get really, really messy, and you find a lot of Easter eggs that you really don't want in your game. It can be real interesting. Real world implications. Post-launch obligations are way more prevalent than they ever used to be because now we actually have things like live operations and DLC and ongoing development. So games will be released and then developers will have obligations beyond release, which was not always the case. As I was saying before, the advance is recouped differently. It's recouped against 100% net more frequently than it is from developers' cut. And even if more often, it's recouped 50-50. So 50% of publisher can recoup 50% from net, and developer can recoup 50% of net. Otherwise, it's done on a pro rata basis. Whoever invested more gets to recoup more off the top. Termination. Termination is kind of tricky these days because of the co-ownership issues and because we have buyout provisions. One of the more interesting ones I've seen lately has been a lien on the title, like a lien on the IP, where they have a security interest in the title, and they can encumber that IP and keep you from doing much with it because of the lien. So it almost functions like a mechanics lien. They can kind of hold on to the IP and keep you from doing much with it until you've repaid them whatever they've paid you up front. So I've seen models like that if, for instance, a developer breaches or terminates inappropriately. Like and this is also unheard of in prior deals. but there are more agreements now where a developer will have more liberal termination rights. So a developer can be the one to terminate, subject to, obviously they'd have to repay the full amount of whatever they received from the publisher. Um, it's not common. It's not something I've seen a lot. I have seen deals that function like that, and it kind of made me raise my eyebrow because that's dangerous no matter how you cut it. But this is what happens when you have new entrants to an industry. They make questionable life choices. Um,
So, do you see deals very often where people will just lose the IP if they miss milestones?
yeah, I see a lot of deals. I mean, that's how the traditional model works, and it still functions. I mean,
It's still pretty common.
yeah, it's still pretty common where if they miss milestones and they don't fulfill the role, then the publisher can take the IP and shop it somewhere else. So again, it comes down, developers have more leverage. That doesn't mean all developers have more leverage, and it doesn't mean all developers are in a position to negotiate properly. This is particularly true if, as I said, developers get desperate. So if you're desperate and you need money to keep your lights on next week, you are willing to sign anything to get that to happen. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea or in the best interest of your company, but it is alarmingly frequent. Yes?
Can development company be its own self-publisher?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's the most common model these days. Independent publishers almost always self-publish it first. I mean, any kind of prototype launch on, for a crowdfunding campaign, there's going to be some level of development and generally a playable model so people can get interested in the game. And that's generally how you get publisher interest or other investor interest so you can get your game funded. But the primary role of publishers now is marketing and distribution. And even distribution is questionable because developers have so many resources in order to do it on their own. So any other questions for me? Or did we cover them all?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm not in a position right now where I want to publish a finished game or anything, but being a college student in game design, I'd like to post my works and my ideas on online resumes so I can get it out there and people can see it. But what would be your tips on still protecting my IP?
What is your school's IP policy, and are you using their school resources to develop?
Which school?
Okay,
So if we publish it or if we use it in class, we don't own it anymore. But if we don't, then it's still ours.
Yeah, it's like the only college that lets the student retain the rights.
They retain the rights if if you're not submitting it to the school.
Yes, if you use it in a assignment for game design or any kind of thing like that, you no longer own it.
Yeah, it's transferred to the schools. Okay. But you can use their tools and technology and develop independently, and if you're not submitting it.
Not submitting it.
Okay. As far as what you need to do in order to protect your IP, it depends on what you want to do with it. If you are using it to, from a real world perspective, if you are just using it to generate business leads and to get a job, I wouldn't stress about it too much because you're probably not going to do anything with the IP anyway. That sounds harsh. That sounded way more harsh than I intended. I'm really sorry. But that's the reality. If you're not going to do anything with it anyway, why stress? Make it work for you. Don't freak out about the IP rights. Don't get all OCD about, oh, somebody's going to steal my rights if I show anybody this. Look, if you're not going to show it to anybody, if you're not going to do anything with it, I can't remember where I read this from, but 90% of success does not come from ideas. It comes from execution. It comes from what you do with it. So, because your idea isn't that great. Everybody has great ideas. Or your idea is wonderful, and that's fantastic, but if you don't do anything with it, who cares? So, if you're going to use it to generate business leads and to generate possible job leads, don't worry too much about the IP aspect. If you are planning on releasing something and you actually really want to make this your baby and develop it into something yourself, don't show it to anybody, ever. Keep anything you release on it under an NDA. If you're showing it to anybody, this includes investors. And if you're bringing anybody on as a contractor, make sure that any contributions they make is subject to their either work for hire or assignment. So make sure that you own everything. Yes.
So how would we go about if, like, because there is an idea that I've had for a long time and I've been sitting on it to try and figure out how to actually IP it, because I've talked to a lot of people at school and they're like, we can't help you. We don't know how to.
They can't give you legal advice. That's the problem. I can give you, what's that?
What was the question?
Oh, she was saying, actually, can we get the mic if you want to?
Well, actually, we don't have a second receiver.
Okay, don't worry about it then. She was asking what she can do with the IP that she's been sitting on and that she wants to do something with, because the people at her school haven't been able to give her any guidance on this subject. And I was saying they can't give her guidance because they can't give legal advice. They run into liability issues as a university. So as far as what you can do with it, and it's hard for me to speak on this issue because I do not have your school's IP policy in front of me, and I would need to confirm your school's IP policy before I gave you any kind of indication of what you can do with your IP. And I'd also need to know what you've done with the IP so far and what you've used in order to create whatever you've created for it. If you have anybody else working on it or that's been working with you on it, you either want a contributor agreement or a collaboration agreement where you guys are divvying up rights appropriately, or you're going to want an assignment from them with regard to that. You're also going to want to make sure that anybody who's worked on the project or you've showed the project to is willing to sign an NDA. And you can embed the NDA obviously into any work for hire or assignment agreement that you're wanting to do. You can register the copyright, but you need to get the most benefit out of copyright registration, you want to register the best version of the product. Now you can register the first 50 pages and the last 50 pages of your code, and that will save it as a literary work.
Will it, like, be more helpful? Because I'm going to go and tell you it's a board game.
Okay. So no code?
No code.
Okay.
Yeah.
Easy. Board games.
Material works differently, and as long as you have printed version has a copyright symbol on it, it's protected.
Well, everything is no, it has nothing to do with it. Copyright symbols, everything is automatically copyrighted from the moment it's put into fixed form. So you don't need a copyright notice on it or anything like that. It's automatically copyrighted from the moment you create it and put it in a fixed format. That being said, if you want documentation of ownership in the event of a copyright infringement suit, because you need to be registered, you need to register with the Copyright Office prior to filing an infringement claim. And on top of that, if you want statutory damages for infringement, you need to register within 6 months of the infringement. Anything after that, you'll only be entitled to actual damages. I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I perused the copyright code. I just mostly do transactions these days. You do want to register. Sooner is better. Generally, register once you have a playable version of the game that you feel is sufficient to protect all of your assets. If you try to register everything independently, it's a mess. You can register it as a collective work. This is doubly useful if you are getting work for hire participants, because work for hire under U.S. law, and actually under most laws, only applies to certain types of works. So an independent contractor who is being treated as a work for hire will retain the rights if the copyrightable subject matter doesn't fall under a particular category within that section of the Copyright Act. So collective works are one of the forms of copyrightable subject matter that can fall under the work for hire provision for independent contractors. So that's useful. I'm not quite sure what you mean by what you want to do with your IP, though. So talk to me afterwards. Go ahead.
She can go to
Do you know how much it costs to file a patent?
No. She'll have the link to copyright signs, 35 bucks.
You can go to copyright.gov.
But there's that link.
Yeah. You have copyright.gov if you want to go to the Copyright Office, and then USPTO for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Trademark is also handy. Trade dress is going to be handy for board games. Difficult to register anything in association with trade dress. Patents cost about $50K, so as a student, I doubt it's something you want to pursue. Unless you get an awesome investor, also a possibility, or your crowdfunding campaign goes really, really well. Board games do remarkably well on Kickstarter. I bought Zombie Apocalypse through Kickstarter, and I love that game and the expansions to it.
I really want to play Secret Hitler.
Oh,
Which was a crowdfunder. Yeah.
Yeah, that one's good.
Okay, haven't played that one.
If you ever have the chance, look up Total Biscuit and them playing it. There's like 8 people and they just sit there and play Secret Hitler and it's great.
Awesome.
Have you played Cards Against Humanity?
Of course, who has not played that game? That game is awesome. Okay, I'll play it happily. I'm sold. All right, so are there any other questions, or if anybody wants to come up to me afterwards, by all means, I'll be here for a while. So if you guys want to chit chat and let me know if you have any questions or specific issues, by all means, come by.